You can challenge ideas, but not people. Good people can disagree. From a challenger mindset standpoint, how do you create an organization where there's enough psychological safety to foster constructive debate?
Donovan, who recently has joined Ascendis Pharmaceuticals in January 2025 as Executive Vice President and President of Ascendis US.
When a patient living with rare condition looks back 10, 15 years from now, and for them to be able to point a moment in time in which they said, I finally felt seen, I finally felt heard, and I finally felt the world around me realize that this rare condition that I have, there is an option for me that allows me to live my life in a meaningfully different way.
How does Ascendis define success beyond just approvals?
To me, success is always, are you in the game of making a transformational step change? Or are you in the game of making an incremental change? When I think about Ascendis and how it is oriented and where it is developed, Ascendis targets very clearly in that transformational step change bucket.
Hi, everybody. I'm very excited about today's episode. We are joined by Donovan, who recently has joined Ascendis Pharmaceuticals in January 2025 as Executive Vice President and President of Ascendis US. Jay is responsible for leading the US organization that spans commercial, medical affairs, government affairs, as well as a number of other key business functions. Prior to Ascendis, Jay spent 13 years at Genentech, where he most recently served as Vice President and Head of Rare Diseases. He led the marketing, the medical, field, access, advocacy, and ops teams to launch multiple products across neurology, hematology. Really excited to have you, Jay. Excited for the discussion. Welcome.
Yeah, Chase, no, thank you for having me, and it's great to see you again.
So, Jay, before we get into the depth of really, there's so many different topics we're going to discuss today. You've obviously had a very diverse and impressive career. What drew you to Ascendis? And out of curiosity, what excites you the most about the mission today?
It's a great question, Chase. And for me, I've seen the bio industry from a variety of angles leading up until this point, right? So started my career in consulting, where I spent a few years working with a variety of companies, plus specialty pharma, as you had mentioned, worked through a variety of rare diseases at Genentech as well. So when I came across Ascendis, I would say there's like a few things that really stood out to me that also really drew me in, right? So first and foremost, when I think about the three tenets of Ascendis, Jan Mikkelsen, our founder CEO, really emphasized the first and foremost being, where do we serve patients in a way where there's the greatest unmet need, right? And I think oftentimes what you find is rare diseases in particular is an area where just a tremendous amount of unmet need is still there, and for which we haven't found either a great therapeutic option for, or there's still a meaningful amount of advancement that can be had. And as someone who is personally and professionally invested in rare disease, that to me is incredibly compelling. The second part is it's fundamentally a science-driven company. And what I really love about Ascendis is there's a elegant simplicity and sophistication associated with the transcon technology for which the Ascendis company is built on, right? And I'm sure we'll get into it more later, but really what that is, it's a proprietary drug delivery platform for which you can deliver a drug with known biological activity in a more sustained and controlled way that can have impacts on efficacy, safety, tolerability, and convenience that allows you to do things that maybe you wouldn't be able to do without using that platform, right? And anytime you can marry science with unmet patient need, I think that's generally a winning combination. But for me, the thing that also tips it over the edge is just everyone here at Ascendis is incredibly passionate about what we do. And it's focused on urgency, both in terms of how do we get this therapy studied, developed, filed faster, but also how do we get that to patients faster? And I think that as an underlying tenet to me is something that really drew me to Ascendis.
No, it's you have an incredible background, Jay. Like I said before, they're very, very lucky to have you. Out of curiosity, when you think about leadership, you've obviously had a very extensive personal journey. How does your personal journey and just the leadership skills that you've garnered over the years really manifest itself into from a leadership quality and just when you really think about the tactics and approach that you take as a leader in such a high stakes science driven environment. Tell me more about how that plays in.
Yeah, and Chase, I love the question around how a personal journey affects leadership because I actually think that oftentimes people assume that leadership in a professional context is perhaps different than how we show up in our personal lives, and I actually think that's fundamentally not true. I think they're intertwined, right? And I guess we're becoming fast friends. I'll share a little bit more about just a tidbit on my background and perhaps how that informs how I show up, not just in a work context, but also in a personal context. So I grew up as a closeted gay man in the Midwest during a time and place where, candidly, it was challenging, right? And I also grew up with a very traditional Taiwanese family that also, again, I think informed maybe some of the initial struggles I had growing up, which I do think with every struggle presents an opportunity for growth on the back end, right? And for me, I think it shows up in three different ways, and I'll kind of go through them each. The first is when you grow up in that environment, I think that you naturally find a way to divorce ideas from identity. And what I really mean by that is this notion of going against the grain or challenging status quo. You run up against people that may have very different beliefs as you do, but they're very good people, some of which were in my own family, candidly. So I think it creates this early appreciation that you can challenge ideas, but not people. Good people can disagree. And that informs, I think, a really big part of how I show up in a professional context, because from a challenger mindset standpoint, how do you create an organization where there's enough psychological safety to foster constructive debate? Right? How can you get the controversial idea on the table, the less popular idea on the table, perhaps an idea from someone quieter in the room that otherwise wouldn't have shared it? Because it's not only a more enriching place to work, I also think that by virtue of having a broader range of potential ideas and solutions on the table whenever you're making a decision, you generally just make better decisions, right? So I think that's the first and foremost way. The second way I would say it shows up is probably around time and this relationship with time and urgency, right? I talked a little bit about how this is very culturally akin to just how Ascendis operates. And I sometimes joke tongue in cheek on I'm a very impatient person. I know that about myself. I'm pretty self-aware. And I think some of that stems from I grew up for the first 2 decades of my life not living in an authentic manner, right? And I do feel like for the rest of my life, I will probably spend trying to make up for lost time. And my husband will tell you, you're just an impatient person regardless, and that's probably true. But I think that ethos of urgency actually is also an element of leadership, right? And it's not so much about creating an unsustainable environment where we're burning people into the ground, and it's more about how do you work smart, how do you work efficiently so that you can find the rate limiting step in anything that you're doing, right? Whether that's drug development and shortening that iterative learning cycle, whether that's trying to shave off some time from a filing timeline, or trying to get product out to patients even sooner. Ultimately, the people that benefit most are patients, right? When you're able to get that drug out even sooner so that patients can benefit more quickly. And I think that is a big part of leadership as well. And last, and I guess, but not least, and I think this one's the one I'm actually most passionate about in some ways, is empathy as a concept is something that I think gets tossed around a lot these days. It's very in vogue. But for me, it's quite personal, right? Because I think I oftentimes will interact with people that don't have the same lived experience that I do, and that's true for all of us, right? But I think you have this just innate appreciation for that when you grew up in an environment and you're constantly surrounded by folks that don't have that lived experience. So you just kind of go through life assuming that there's more to it than meets the eye. And I think from a leadership standpoint and a professional standpoint, empathy is incredibly important because it naturally orients leaders from a place of curiosity and seeking to understand. And when you translate that into seeking to understand patient experience, it's incredibly powerful because a lot of the things that we talk about Ascendis here as an organization is, well, what is that patient journey like? Have you actually dialed the call center yourself? What are the forms that we're asking people to fill out? And have you actually tried to fill it out yourself? And when you actually go through that journey, sometimes again, you arrive at perhaps a different appreciation for the problem that you're trying to solve, but a different solution subset for which you're drawing from. And I'll kind of paint a picture of it outside of even just Ascendis, which is, prior to coming here, I actually mentioned before, I have a personal connection to rare disease, right? So my brother-in-law actually has cystic fibrosis, and he was on a therapy that I actually became accountable for in my previous job. And being in a situation where knowing the decisions that you're making and the discussions that you're having with your team is directly impacting patients and communities, and in this instance, my own family, I think gives you a different appreciation for what empathy means in a work context.
Diversified thought and approach, radical transparency, radical candor, willingness to get your team members to openly share their ideas, because you never know. There could be a new hypothesis tested. There could always be a new strategic idea that could result in better commercial decision making, and empathy. Empathy for patients, empathy for colleagues. And really, I want to call it more of a lived empathy that you've had given the close knit relationship, of course, you have with a patient, given the product that you were overseeing, and being able to see and understand the pain points and problems that your family member had to go through each and every day, and using that as the feedback loop, along with all of the other data that you have, is really truly incredible and really does bring a different perspective to the life sciences industry. I'm happy you shared that story, Jay, because I think that it's very easy in the field of science for us to, we talk a lot about empathy, but it's also very easy for that part of who we are to get blunted. We see it with surgeons in the healthcare system. We see it with internal medicine doctors, cardiovascular disease specialists. It's just when you're exposed to so many patients and so much, and it's these reminders that shifts the mindset and shifts the perspective and really brings an entirely different point of view to how we think about shaping the future of healthcare, especially an area like rare disease, where, again, I always say it's for any one condition, that disease might be rare. But when you add up the number of rare diseases that exists, it's 10% of the US population. It's quite a number of individuals who have been or will be diagnosed with a rare disease. So I really appreciate you sharing that. One of the things that really stands out about Ascendis is the Transcon technology platform. I know it's, as you mentioned, it's not just a delivery mechanism, right? It's a strategic engine for how you develop and extend the line of therapeutics. For those individuals listening who aren't deep into the science, can you walk us through what the Transcon enables and really how it helps you choose which diseases to go after?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think when you think about the transcon technology in particular, what it stands for is transient conjugation. So think about it as like temporary linking, right? Where essentially what you're doing is you're linking a few key components, right? One component is an unmodified parent drug. right? So you know what it is, you know how it works, but for whatever reason, sometimes delivering it into the body can be tricky or challenging, either because, maybe it doesn't last for a very long time because the half-life is short, or maybe the stability of it is in a way where it needs to be delivered in a more controlled mechanism. But you essentially have an unmodified parent drug and you link it in an inert carrier, right? So think about that almost as the analogy we like to use is almost like a benign gift wrap, right? You're putting it in a benign gift wrap to deliver it into the body. And then over time, essentially the packaging goes away, allowing for a more sustained, controlled delivery of the unmodified parent drug. So the effects that can have is actually quite profound. And a few examples, right? When you think about efficacy, oftentimes when you're delivering a drug into the body, you're activating certain receptors that then triggers certain downstream cascades. But the actual biological agent may not actually be interacting with the receptor for an extended period of time. Right. So every time you dose, you're kind of putting a little bit more, you're activating the receptor and then it goes away. You're putting in a little bit more, you're activating the receptor and then it goes away. But then think about it, if you're able to deliver it in a more controlled, sustained way, the time for which you are activating that receptor might actually be for a more extended period of time. You also can meaningfully cut down on potential adverse events or side effects as a result of that more controlled release, right? And then even that starts to tie in a little bit with convenience as well, because of that sustained release, you can go into situations where maybe patients that are used to needing an injection daily, for example, to try to achieve a certain effect, if you can now all of a sudden provide a meaningful and potentially even better in some instances effect, but on a weekly basis, right? You can imagine that ultimately gives people a chance to live their lives in a different way than they previously have been able to. They can start to focus more on what they want to do versus administering a therapy for which they historically might have had to get daily or in some instances even more frequently than daily injection. All of which I think contribute to an incredibly compelling platform for which we can study and develop drugs, right? And the second part of the question I think I heard you ask was, well, in what areas do we typically think about it in? Because the beauty of the Transcon platform is that it is applicable in so many areas, right? Where you can get and achieve actually a higher rate of developmental success because you're operating already from a place of a known unmodified parent drug for which you know how the biological activity works, right? And some of the areas that you've seen us enter into, again, I go back to Ascendis is a very patient-driven organization, so we focus on the areas of highest unmet need. And it's not a coincidence that the area that you've seen a lot of our initial development efforts take place in is rare endocrine disease. Rare conditions because there are incredibly high areas of unmet need. But endocrine, because when you think about hormones in the body, it's a very delicate system, right? Where a little too much or a little bit not enough can have profound multi-organ effects throughout the body. So when you're thinking about something that requires that level of precision, like endocrine therapy, it's actually a perfect place to invest a lot of our developmental and scientific efforts in. And we're seeing that play out in the products that we have. Our first long-acting growth hormone therapy was, launched in 2021, and then earlier this year, we of course launched and made commercially available the first and only approved for hypoparathyroidism, and then most recently, we also have compelling pivotal data, and we recently filed for that NDA filing for a new product in achondroplasia as well. So you can see that this is something that really has a demonstrated track record of success and will continue to make advances on behalf of these patients living with rare endocrine conditions.
Jay, you're in a really, really unique seat. You're leading a company that's investing deeply in long-term R&D while also navigating the realities of short-term commercial expectations. That's not an easy balance. How do you personally approach that tension between these two areas, and how do you keep the organization aligned around both the future and the now?
When I think about the trade-off, Chase, of short-term and long-term, it is a very salient question now, right? There's a lot of macroeconomic trends at play currently and a lot of uncertainty for the biopharma industry as a whole. So now more than ever, we need to operate in a lean and sustainable way when you're thinking about scaling our efforts, particularly during a time of growth, right? And Ascendis is in a unique position in that it is a scrappy biotech, but at the same time, like we are scaling, right? Because our therapies have um, the clinical profile that it does and the impact that can have, like we do need to scale our organization responsibly in a way that allows us to reach the patients that need those therapies while creating a platform for sustained growth in the long run. And for me, when you think about trade-off between R&D and perhaps some of the near-term commercialization considerations, I almost think about it from the lens of what's the common denominator for which you can be more likely to make an apples to apples comparison, right? And the common denominator for Ascendis has always been patience. And I know that sounds contrived, but let's break it down a little bit, right? So when I think about I'll just use random numbers, but as a way to make the example, if we invest a certain amount in continued outreach for our existing products, let's say you can impact another 10,000 patients over the next 3 years. But if you instead invest all or some of those chips into perhaps R&D long-term pipeline, maybe you could impact um, 15,000 patients, but 6, 7 years from now with a certain probability overlay, right? And then all of a sudden, when you're speaking the same language across the entire organization, rooted on the thing that everyone cares about, right? Patients, you're much better able to make some of those trade-offs across the organization in a thoughtful and mission-driven way. And what I would say is, it's easy to fall into the trap of assuming if you do more of A, you're doing less of B, and therefore it's a zero-sum game. But I'll tell you, like the R&D leaders are sometimes the biggest proponents and advocates on the investments that we make in a near-term commercial organization. And similarly, the commercial leaders are oftentimes the most loudest and staunch advocates for how we make investments in the R&D organization. And again, I think that is rooted in the principle that this entire organization was founded on behalf of patients, and we continue to drive that mission on behalf of patients.
Very, very well said. I everything that you're hitting on also pulls into this theme of innovation. What does true innovation look like to you in biotech today? And how does Ascendis define success beyond just approvals?
So I think I have a knee-jerk reaction to that. And to me, success is always, are you in the game of making a transformational step change?
Mhm.
Are you in the game of making an incremental change?
Yep.
And for me, when I think about Ascendis and how it is oriented and where it is developed, like Ascendis targets very clearly in that transformational step change bucket, right? Like rare diseases in particular. Oftentimes, these are areas for which there just been few advancements or no advancements. And then by virtue of entering into those spaces, you are seeking to make a transformational step change. Right. And when I think about the history of biotech industry as a whole, there's like a lot of step changes you can probably think of. Like we can even come up with them together, right? There's checkpoint inhibitors in oncology. There was the wave of disease modifying therapies for cystic fibrosis and also spinal muscular atrophy, right? Going from 0 to 1, 1 to 3. Like these are the waves where people look back at history and they're like, wow, that was a transformational step change. And what we're doing at Ascendis is very much aligned with that. And I'll give you a tangible example, right? Like hypoparathyroidism, right? It's essentially a condition where patients, either through hereditary reasons or maybe through surgery, have had impact on their parathyroid that then prevents them from producing a normal level of parathyroid hormone. And as I talked about before, hormones are a very delicate system within the body that has multi-organ effects, right? When you think about muscle weakness and fatigue, it kidney failure, cognition, seizures, maybe even impacts the heart. Like the impacts of it are just so far ranging and so impactful for these patients where their pill burden off of having to take supplements, whether it's calcium, vitamin D, was only part of the problem, but the level of pill burden that they had to take for something like that was just incredibly high. Right? You heard from some patients where they actually had to set an alarm clock for themselves, wake themselves up in the middle of the night, because if they didn't take enough pills, even while they were sleeping, they wouldn't feel well enough the next day to live that life.
Yeah.
And now being able to have an option where you have a daily injection that actually affects the root of the issue, which is, again, that hormonal deficiency around parathyroid, that actually is a transformational step change that we just haven't had before for a lot of these patients. And that's incredibly compelling.
Yeah, I mean, versus addressing some of the, the calcium or phosphorus differences within the blood, really going to the root cause of it. I really love that example, Jay. It's a great one. One of the things that sets Ascendis apart is its serious focus on rare diseases. What separates Ascendis from other rare disease focused companies? Can you share a moment where a patient story has really impacted your experience in rare? I know you shared one earlier from from a family lens perspective, and it's a great story. It's a personal story, but any other stories you can share for some of the disease areas that Ascendis is focused on?
Yeah. We have so many, Chase, but I'll give you a couple that I think really brings it to life. And when I think about how Ascendis really stands apart, again, I go back to Yan founded this company with patients being in the center and forefront, and therefore a lot of what drives our efforts are these patient stories, knowing that we're making that tangible impact, right? And it's easy to fall into the trap. We could go into primary endpoints, and this is what it meant for tetany and cognition. But actually, I think bringing it to life is a lot more compelling, right? So, first example I'll give you. What is tetany? Tetany is essentially it's muscle spasm, right? Like if you've ever had like a Charlie horse where it's like really painful and it locks up, like we've probably had that experience. And, when you say it like that, it sounds benign enough. But I won't forget there was one patient advocate that was sharing her story with me and multiple folks in our organization. And she was talking about how tetany affect her life. And her tetany, sometimes and oftentimes caused by a calcium crash, right, was so severe that her entire body would lock up during these bouts of tetany to the point where her jaw would also lock up and she physically would not be able to speak, to be able to get the advocacy or to explain to someone nearby what her condition was and why she needed to go to a hospital like right in that moment. And she would describe that pain from that tetany as being 10 to 100 times worse than the pain of childbirth. So I'll just pause on that for a second, right? Like childbirth and have it being so much more so than that, I think certainly paints a seemingly benign term like tetany in a very different light, right? And layered onto that, the literal inability to advocate for herself during those moments, I think is an incredibly scary and disempowering experience for many patients. Another example to bring it to life, we talk about cognition effects of hypoparathyroidism, brain fog, right? Again, seemingly a benign effect, right? There's another patient that was telling us, she used to travel to her best friend's house. They live maybe 10 minutes away at, over a course of a lifetime have probably been to her best friend's house over 100 times, if not thousands, right? And one day she was driving and just in the middle of that 10-minute journey that she's made over and over and over again, she suddenly just could not remember where she was to the point where she actually had to physically pull over, call her husband, and her husband actually had to talk her through getting out of the car, walking to the nearest intersection so she could look up, read the street sign, relay it to him so that he could actually go retrieve her and move her to a safe location. And when you talk about something like brain fog to physicians or providers, like it can easily be sometimes dismissed as, oh, like you're just being forgetful. Or, oh, you're maybe at a certain age right now. So that's just, a natural course of aging. But when you paint that picture, again, incredibly scary, robbing you of an agency and feeling like you can do the things that you normally want to do in an autonomous way, it brings to life the effects of hypoparathyroidism and the multi-organ and systemic effects that can have on people in a very real way. And I think that to me is part of why working in rare diseases is so meaningful because when you think about hypoparathyroidism, for a while, like this might have been relegated to just a few sentences in a medical textbook when people are going through and training in this specialty field, right? Because it doesn't impact the majority of people. But the more you understand the disease and the more you realize this could actually affect up to 70 to 90,000 people in the US. Even 7,000 would be too many, right? But the virtue of the more we know about it, the more we realize this is something we should be spending time and attention and investment in, and making sure we give these patients and so many other patients with rare conditions a voice is incredibly important and why Ascendis is doing what it does.
Two conditions I have seen patients very negatively affected by. Um, Many others, but I've seen the effects of brain fog. Um, I've seen the effects of tetany. Uh, it's just really crazy to me how we as humans lack the ability to truly empathize unless we have experienced what that person has experienced. Now, I'm not, of course, saying, Jay, I'm not a proponent for people for creating a simulatory environment where individuals might receive or might have the manifestation of certain symptoms. So they start to have greater levels of empathy. That's not what I'm suggesting, especially in this AI digital age where we have certain technologies that I'm sure can support systemic manifestation. But I do think that we as a population, we as individuals, anyone that's working in healthcare has to find a way to really truly empathize with these patients. Because it's so easy, as you mentioned, to dismiss something as, oh, it's fatigue, you just didn't get enough sleep last night. And I see it all the time. It's unfortunate. Some of my physician colleagues, I know you're listening to this, and you know what I'm talking about. Every single one of us has dismissed certain patients based off of symptom reports or review of systems that we're reading about when it comes to any history of present illness. We sometimes brush over it. It's easy to ignore it. Jay, the thing that I like, and I'm going to share a story with you, is how AI is starting to change that. There is actually an individual posted in a Reddit blog about having very bad TMJ. Went to many, many different doctors who tried to help him, couldn't help him. Went on to ChatGPT, typed in his symptoms. ChatGPT recommended a series of personalized exercises for him to do for his TMJ. Posted it on Reddit. Other people on Reddit responded saying they were doing the same thing, and it was the only thing that helped. So the fascinating thing that I'm bringing up is in an age where we now have tools that are democratizing really the diagnostic as well as the potential systemic relief, because it's no longer just talk with your doctor. We know that every patient is also going to be speaking or talking with AI. I think it's going to vastly change so much of the diagnostic as well as the just the systemic relieving journey for so many different diseases. You mentioned earlier how real innovation isn't just about approvals, right? It's about changing lives. That really makes me think more deeply about how and when patients are brought into the process. Involving them during trials is obviously standard now, but what about earlier, right? How do you think about bringing patients' insight into the drug development journey, even before maybe a protocol is written or a molecule is prioritized?
I think you hit the nail on the head around patient involvement needing to happen sooner. And, in my role, because I've spent so many years in my career in rare diseases generally, I oftentimes have friends or family or friends of friends reach out because maybe someone in their family or their own child has an incredibly rare condition. And oftentimes, what you find is these are very motivated caregivers to get as much information as possible because, particularly for these ultra rare conditions, right? There may not be a ton of literature available. There may not be a ton of scientific understanding that's widely published and or having multiple either industry companies or maybe even academic centers actively investing in the research and understanding the nature of why these conditions are partially perhaps due to awareness, partially due to the fact that it's difficult to scale and study, which you can maybe only find 4 case reports across the globe, right? And to me, it comes down to a few things in which we engage some of these patient groups early, right? One is beyond just clinical trial recruitment, which I think you talked about. It's actually leveraging and hearing the voice of a lot of patient advocates, even when you're starting to think about what are some disease areas that we might want to explore. What is the actual manifestation of what you experience so that you can design a even primary endpoint or patient population or measurables that are meaningful to what improved life means for this group, right? And I think what's really unique about rare conditions versus maybe a broader swath of therapeutic area like oncology where there's multiple tumor types, it's not like it's a duration of response or ORR or PFS, like some of these more established endpoints. For these rare conditions, sometimes you have to like create them from scratch, right? Because no one's actually studied it before. There's no blueprint to follow. So how do you make something up out of thin air without actually consulting patient groups to find out what's meaningful, right? And that to me is incredibly compelling. And I think beyond just even clinical trial design, sometimes even years and years before that, you also need to just amplify and elevate the voices from a patient advocacy standpoint, from a pure disease education awareness perspective. And I think this is where Ascendis also partners quite a bit with advocacy groups, even beyond some of the areas for which we have a clinical trial already being designed and enrolled, right? And I think in tandem, it's not just Ascendis. There are some amazing organizations out there like NORD, right? The National Organization of Rare Disorders that does try to take a almost a coalition-like aspect look at the constellation of rare conditions out there, knowing that it is difficult to scale on your own. It is difficult to generate the level of awareness investment on your own. But when you put these things all together, sometimes there are areas for which you realize there may be more in common than they are that sets them apart, which allows that scale that you were talking about before to give this community of individuals living with rare conditions a voice that they otherwise might not have.
Jay, the passion at which you share the stories, I can hear the empathy in your voice, by the way. Ascendis is incredibly lucky to have you. I mean that sincerely. I'm not just saying that because we're on a recorded podcast. You can really tell the authenticity in your voice, in your tone, in your delivery. So Ascendis team, I have to say it again. You're very, very lucky to have Jay. Truly. Um, Jay, where do you see Ascendis 5 years from now? And what's the story you want people sharing about the company?
I think 5 years from now, in some ways that's not long enough, right? Because when I think about true transformational step change that we talked about before, to me, that's about legacy and lasting impact, right? And when I hope to see, and what I do feel confident that Ascendis is already on the pathway to achieving, is when a patient living with a rare condition looks back 10, 15 years from now, and for them to be able to point a moment in time in which they said, I finally felt seen, I finally felt heard, and I finally felt like the world around me realized that this rare condition that I have, that there is an option for me that allows me to live my life in a meaningfully different way than I could before. And it's those markers where you really only maybe get one or two in a lifetime, if even, that you can look back and point to that moment. And again, I'm speaking as someone who has spent the vast majority of his career in rare diseases and as a family member who also knows what that experience is like. A lot of the therapies that I've even worked on, or again, even in the instance of my own family, like they had this condition even before the first disease modifying therapy came out. You can wait a whole lifetime for a change like this to happen and have it not happen, right? So when I think about Ascendis and the story that I think it will tell, it's that given the patient-rooted nature of everything that we do, focusing on the areas where there's greatest unmet need and marrying that high science to it so that you can create transformational step change. That's the story that I hope that people will remember and look back to.
Jay, this has been incredible. I can't thank you enough. Really excited to have you back as you continue to discuss and see the progress that Ascendis is going through, and excited to learn more again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the chance to chat about a topic that I'm incredibly passionate about, rare conditions, and of course, a company that I really feel like is doing amazing things and truly aligned with what that rare condition patient community needs. So thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.